It all started when I decided to visit my parents over spring break. I hadn't seen them in a while, and a road trip sounded like a good way to take a break from everything. Since the city they lived in was pretty small, hotel options were limited, but Airbnb had plenty of choices and the rentals were really cheap. It seemed like an easy decision. So I booked a small house in a quiet neighborhood, packed up my car, and set off on the 2-day drive. The trip itself was long but uneventful, just hours of open road, gas station snacks, and music playing in the background. By the time I finally reached the Airbnb, the sun had just set. I pulled into the driveway and stretched my legs before grabbing my bags. The first thing I noticed was how empty the neighborhood felt. It wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. There were no streetlights, no people walking around, no cars passing by. The houses around me were almost completely dark, except for one or two that had a small light on in the window. The house I was staying in was the only one with its lights on, which made it stand out in a weird way. I tried to brush off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe this is just a sleepy neighborhood, I told myself. Not every place is busy at night. I headed inside, dragging my bags behind me. The house itself was nice. Nothing fancy, but clean and cozy. It had a small living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom with a big, comfortable bed. After such a long drive, all I wanted to do was relax. I had no plans for the night except to rest, so I grabbed some snacks from my bag, climbed into bed, and turned on a movie. Everything was fine for the first few hours. The house was quiet, and I was getting comfortable. Then, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard something. A knock at the front door. I sat up, startled. At first I thought maybe I imagined it, but a few seconds later I heard it again. Knock. Knock, knock. I grabbed my phone and checked my notifications. No missed calls, no texts. The Airbnb host hadn't tried to contact me, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Now this wasn't just a casual one-time knock. It was persistent, as if whoever was outside was determined to get my attention. Feeling uneasy, I slowly got up and walked toward the door. The knocking continued the entire time, steady and unrelenting. When I finally opened the door, I was met with a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a black winter hat and a red flannel shirt that looked a little worn out. His expression was strange, almost like he was confused to see me. Hi, I said, trying to sound normal. The man stared at me for a second, then gave an awkward, half-hearted smile before his face went blank again. He mumbled something, under his breath, turned around and walked away without another word. I stood there watching him disappear down the street. My heart was still racing. What just happened? Why would someone knock so many times just to leave without saying anything? Had he mistaken this house for another? If so, why not say something? I locked the door and went back to the bedroom, still feeling a little shaken. But after a while, I convinced myself it was just a weird misunderstanding. Maybe he had the wrong house and felt embarrassed. The rest of the night passed without anything unusual, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early and spent the entire day with my parents. It was nice catching up with them, and by the time I got back to the rental that evening, I was exhausted. I changed into my pajamas, got into bed, and turned on the TV, ready to wind down. And then, at exactly 9 p.m., the knocking started again. My stomach dropped. I sat up, my pulse already racing. I reached for my phone and checked my messages, but there was nothing. I walked toward the door, but this time I was more cautious. Instead of opening it right away, I looked through the peephole first. And there he was. The same man, same black hat, same red flannel. Just standing there, knocking over and over. A cold chill ran down my spine. Why was he back? What did he want? I cracked open the door, only enough so I could speak. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His reaction was almost identical to the night before, except this time, it was more exaggerated. He looked genuinely shocked to see me, like he had expected someone else to answer. "Is everything okay?" "Were you looking for someone?" I asked again. The man just stared at me with a blank expression. Then, in a flat, emotionless voice, he said one word: "No." Then he turned and walked away. I stood frozen in place, watching him disappear into the darkness, my hands shaking slightly as I closed the door. At this point, I was no longer just confused. I was terrified. I didn't know what he wanted, but something about him felt wrong. It wasn't just that he had come back, it was the way he looked at me, like he was surprised I was there, like he was expecting someone else. I went back to the bedroom, but this time I didn't close the door. I wanted to be able to hear everything. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The room was completely dark and silent, but I had the strange feeling that something had woken me up. Then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but then a loud, harsh knock at the front door made me jump. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat up. Something about this knock was different from before. It wasn't steady and repetitive. It was aggressive. As I slowly walked down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of movement outside. Someone was moving past one of the windows. I stopped in my tracks. When I reached the front door and peeked out, I saw him again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Further back, another figure stood. In the darkness, they were clearly hiding. I felt my entire body go cold. My stomach twisted in fear. I turned to go grab my phone, but then I locked eyes with another man staring at me through the back window. That was it. I ran. I sprinted into the bedroom, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. Almost immediately, I heard footsteps outside. Not just one or two. There were several people running around the house trying to open windows and doors. Then, finally, sirens in the distance. And just like that, they were gone. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They contacted the Airbnb host, but his reaction was strange. Almost like he didn't care. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. Maybe they were looking for the previous guest. Maybe they had some unfinished business with the host, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is I will never stay at an Airbnb again. Ever. My name is Lisa, and when I was a senior in high school, I got my first job at a little pizza shop in town. It wasn't a fancy place, just one of those small, cozy restaurants where people would come in for a quick slice after school or work. The pay wasn't great, but at 18 I was just happy to have my own money. I mostly worked in the evenings, especially on weekends and sometimes on Thursdays. The work itself wasn't exciting. I spent a lot of time folding pizza boxes, taking orders and cleaning up after customers, but I got along with most of my coworkers, which made it bearable. Some nights the place got so busy that I barely had a second to breathe. Other nights it was slow, and I'd stand around wiping down counters that were already clean just to look busy. After a while, I started making friends at work. One of the first people I got close to was Jake. He was a couple of years older than me, probably around 20, but we got along well from the start. We had the same sense of humor, dark, sarcastic, and a little messed up. We'd crack jokes that most people would probably find offensive, trying to see who could make the other laugh first. It was just our way of having fun. Outside of work, Jake and I started hanging out more. Since I wasn't old enough to go to bars, we mostly played video games, watched movies, or just sat around talking. Sometimes we hung out with other coworkers, but a lot of the time it was just the two of us. He had his own apartment, which meant we could stay up late without worrying about parents or curfews. At first, I thought Jake was just a little rough around the edges. He wasn't the most responsible guy. He never talked about college or future plans like some of our other coworkers did. He mostly lived in the moment, doing whatever sounded fun at the time. I figured he was just one of those guys who had a hard time growing up, but I never thought he was a bad person. It wasn't until later that I started noticing little things about him that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes Jake would take our jokes too far. I'd say something sarcastic, and he'd respond with something that wasn't just dark. It was genuinely disturbing. He'd laugh it off like it was nothing, but there was something about the way he said certain things that made me uneasy. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, I made dark jokes too, so who was I to judge? But every once in a while, I'd catch a look in his eyes or hear a certain tone in his voice that made me wonder if he was really joking. Looking back, there were a lot of small red flags that I ignored. Jake had a habit of talking about people he didn't like in a way that felt off. He didn't just say he disliked them. He'd talk about hurting them, about how they deserved to suffer. He got into fights sometimes, and while I figured he just had a short temper, he never acted that way around me, so I didn't think much of it. The truth was, I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. One night, Jake told me he wanted to take me to a bar he liked. I reminded him that I wasn't old enough to get in, but he waved it off, saying he knew the guy at the door and could get me inside. I hesitated for a second, but then I figured, why not? It sounded like fun, and I trusted him. The bar wasn't anything fancy, just a dark, slightly run-down place with neon beer signs on the walls and music playing a little too loud. Since it was my first time in a bar, it felt exciting. Jake's friends were already there when we arrived. They were all guys in their mid-20s who seemed to know each other well. Nobody cared that I was underage, and before I knew it, someone handed me a beer. We sat around, talking and joking like usual. I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy. After a while, Jake's friends left, and it was just the two of us. That's when things got weird. Jake started talking about how much he wanted to kill someone. At first, I thought he was joking, just another one of his dark, messed up comments. But he didn't stop there. He started getting into details, describing exactly how he'd do it, how he'd get away with it, and why certain people deserved it. I laughed nervously, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were serious, and there was something in his expression that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to brush it off. Okay, Jake, that's enough. You're freaking me out. But he just leaned in closer, smirking. I'm not kidding. I forced a laugh, hoping he was just messing with me. But something about the way he was acting made me want to leave. We eventually left the bar and started walking down the street. I thought about going home, but I didn't want to overreact, so I kept walking with him. Then he pointed at a man, standing at a bus stop. See that guy? He said casually. It'd be so easy to kill someone like that. I felt my stomach tighten. Jake, seriously, cut it out. He just smirked, but didn't say anything else. A little while later, we passed another guy walking alone. He was maybe in his early 30s, kind of nerdy looking, with glasses and a small frame. He was walking fast, like he had somewhere to be. As he passed us, Jake deliberately bumped into him. The guy stumbled back and muttered something under his breath. Jake immediately turned on him. What did you just say? The guy looked nervous. Nothing, man, just... Jake stepped closer and shoved him. The guy tried to back away, but Jake wasn't letting it go. He was trying to start a fight. I grabbed his arm. Jake, stop it. Let's just go. He shoved me aside, and before I could react, he pulled a knife. The guy froze. I could see the fear in his eyes. For a second, I thought he was about to run, but instead he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Before I even had time to scream, he fired. Jake staggered back, grabbing his side before collapsing onto the pavement. I stood there, my heart pounding, my brain struggling to process what had just happened. Then I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The guy with the gun didn't run. He just stood there, shaking, his face pale. Within minutes, sirens filled the air and the street was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The police arrived, followed by an ambulance. Jake was still conscious when they took him away. I was pretty sure he was going to make it. I told the cops everything. I didn't try to protect Jake. He had started it. He was the one who pulled a knife. The guy with the gun wasn't charged. He had acted in self-defense. Jake survived, but after that night, we never spoke again. He was furious that I had talked to the cops, but I didn't care. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. I should have realized sooner that he wasn't just a guy with a dark sense of humor. He was dangerous. And that night, he almost got himself killed because of it. I've worked as a security guard for a few years now. Most nights are slow, nothing much happens, and honestly, it can get a little boring. But once in a while, something happens that shakes you up. Something that reminds you why you're there, in the first place. I worked at an office building in Los Angeles. Crime wasn't rare around there. Break-ins, thefts, people sneaking around where they shouldn't be. Most businesses had some kind of security, but that didn't always stop the bad guys from trying their luck. I had been on the job for about 3 years, and while I had seen some things, most nights were quiet. That night, I was on shift with a guy named Bobby. He was new, maybe early 20s, skinny, shaved head, and covered in tattoos. Not the friendliest looking guy. If I passed him on the street at night, I'd probably think twice before making eye contact. But hey, looks don't always tell the whole story, right? The problem was Bobby didn't talk much, at all. I tried to make small talk, maybe get to know him a little, but he just gave short answers and kept to himself. Some guys are just like that, so I didn't push it. That night we were sitting at the front desk together, watching the security monitors, waiting for our shift to end. It was one of those nights where nothing was happening, not a single person in sight. To break up the boredom, I decided to take a short walk around the building. Just a little loop, stretch my legs, check things out. Bobby stayed at the desk while I made my way to the front window. I liked looking outside every now and then, kept me from dozing off. But this time, something caught my eye. 2 men were standing across the street. They weren't talking, they weren't walking, they were just standing there. And they were staring straight at the building. At first, I thought, maybe they're just waiting for someone. But something about them felt off. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't checking a watch, just standing there facing us. For a second, I thought about stepping outside, maybe asking if they needed help, or if they were lost. But then I decided against it. If they were just waiting for someone, I didn't want to start trouble over nothing. After a couple of minutes, I turned back to the desk. Bobby was still glued to his phone. "See anything?" he asked, not even looking up. "Just a couple of guys across the street," I said. He shrugged. "Probably nothing." Maybe he was right. I kept an eye on them for a little while, but eventually they walked off. I told myself I was overthinking it. It's a big city. People stand around all the time. The next day, I mentioned it to another coworker. He'd been working at the building longer than me, so I figured he'd know if something weird was going on. But he just waved it off. "People hang out around there all the time," he said. "It's nothing." A week passed and I didn't see those guys again. I forgot all about it. I kept working, kept doing my shifts with Bobby, but something about him didn't sit right with me. With most of my coworkers, I could joke around, have a few laughs to pass the time. But Bobby, He just wasn't that kind of guy. Then came Wednesday night. I was back on the late shift with Bobby. Another slow night. I took my usual walk around the building, and when I got to the front window, I froze. The same two men were standing there, same spot, same stillness, same way they were looking at the building. This time, I decided I wasn't just going to stand there and wonder. I stepped outside, leaned against the wall, and just waited. I didn't say anything. I just wanted them to see that I saw them. A few minutes passed. Then without a word, they turned and walked off. I tried to get a better look at their faces, but it was too dark. Something about the way they moved, the way they left as soon as I came out. It made my skin crawl. I stayed outside for a little longer, just to be sure they were really gone. Then I went back inside to take my break. Bobby was still at the desk, eyes on his phone like always. I grabbed a sandwich from the break room, sat down, and tried to shake the weird feeling in my gut. I told myself I was just being paranoid. About 10 minutes later, I heard a noise from the hallway, something falling over. I figured Bobby could handle it, so I kept eating. Then I heard shouting. I jumped up so fast I knocked over my drink. When I got to the front lobby, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Bobby was on the ground, completely knocked out. And the two men, they were standing over him. Before I could react, one of them turned toward me. My heart was pounding, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out and call for help. I spun around and bolted toward the side exit. I barely made it a few steps before I felt a hand grab the back of my shirt and yank me down. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Before I could even try to get up, one of the men pinned me down, his knee pressing into my back. I struggled, but he was stronger than me. I could hear the other guy moving around near Bobby, but I had no idea what they were doing. One of my arms was trapped under me, but the other was free. I reached into my pocket, grabbed my phone, and fumbled to press the emergency call button. The guy on top of me didn't seem to notice. The call connected, and I shouted the building's address as loud as I could. As soon as the man realized what I was doing, he jumped off me and ran. I scrambled to my feet just in time to see both of them bolting through the front doors. My shoulder ached from the fall, but I forced myself up and ran to check on Bobby. He was still out cold, but at least he was breathing. The police arrived a few minutes later. They checked on Bobby, asked me what happened, and started looking around. At first, I had no idea how those men had gotten into the building without setting off any alarms. But we found the answer soon enough. After checking the security footage, we saw it clear as day. Bobby had let them in. I don't know what his connection to them was, but it didn't matter. He was fired the next day, and the police started looking for the men. I had worked in security for years, but this was the first time I had ever been attacked on the job. After that night, I was a lot more careful about who I trusted. A few weeks later, I heard that the police caught the two men. Just a couple of street thugs, nothing special. And Bobby? Turns out he had been talking to them for weeks before the attack. I never found out exactly what they wanted from the building, but honestly, it didn't matter. All I knew was that they were off the streets, and I was never going to ignore my gut feeling again.